basically what we're going to do is we're going to just go around here, introduce ourselves, everybody has a couple things to say, but then really we want to spend the overwhelming bulk of the time on your questions and comments and discussion, and certainly I have some questions for all of the panelists, but we really want to hear whatever you want to discuss and also why you're here. So my name is Pete Sigal, and I'm Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of History at Duke University. And I think, and the reason that I decided to come and decided to chair this panel is that this, in fact, is a point of discussion for me every single day. And our graduate students at Duke are consistently nervous about the academic job market. And we hear almost every day in the department, whether it's among colleagues or graduate students, about the crisis in humanities education. And we are constantly faced with this idea of a crisis, and we are constantly faced with this idea that that the job market, the academic job market, is contracting. And of course, that is a fact. We can back that up with numbers that the academic job market is contracting. What that does for me as Director of Graduate Studies is it turns me into a therapist most of the time. And this is not necessarily an ideal situation, certainly not what I was trained to do. So one of the things that I did last year, or 2 years ago now, is that I looked very closely at the numbers as to who was getting a job in the academic job market and who wasn't. And I found, and this is, and of course, take this as just one elite institution among many. But what I found was about 2/3 of our graduate students who got the PhD were in tenure-track jobs. I then looked back at the numbers for over the past 15 years and found that, lo and behold, 15 years ago, about 2/3 of the students who received a PhD were in tenure-track positions. Nowadays, it seems like it's taking, and the numbers are a little unclear on this, but it seems like it's taking a couple years longer for students to get into the tenure track position, but there's still about 2/3 of them are getting tenure track positions. That's just a way of saying that I think this idea of a crisis in humanities education is perhaps a bit overstated, that there's a certain consistency, at least in an institution like Duke. Now, that's not to say there aren't crises there. I mean, if you look at the numbers overall, clearly there are less jobs out there, and about the same number of students getting PhDs. But the more important point for me, as in my position, was that we have always had 1/3 of our students not getting tenure track jobs, and we haven't been talking to those students. We haven't been training them appropriately, and we haven't been thinking about these real jobs outside of academia. We have always treated it as if it were a plan B, right? And as if it were some sort of failure on our part or on the students' part if they were not to get academic jobs. And the fact is that there have always been a number of students, a number of PhD students who have chosen not to get academic jobs, and I don't know why they wouldn't love an academic job, how much time I spend on committees and all the, how much administrative work I do that drives me crazy. But in any case, there are a significant number of students who are out there who do not want academic jobs, who want other kinds of real jobs. And so that, I think, is the purpose of this panel, to address this large group of PhD students, in addition to the students, of course, who try to get tenure-track jobs and simply do not find them. So now what I'd like to do is just go around and have the panelists introduce themselves and say a few words. So, do you want to start at the other end?
Okay, sure.
I want to go last, that's why.
Okay, my name is Alex Pong, and I actually studied history of science rather than straight on history, so I hope, however, I was still able to get through the registration process, so I'm in. So anyway, I actually want to, I have a couple of brief points to make. I will start by making the argument, though, that what I see in the data suggests that this is not a crisis, because a crisis is something that ends. A crisis is something that has some kind of endpoint. I think what we are seeing instead, and I will insert that I work as a technology forecaster and futurist at a place called Strategic Business Insights, which is a consulting company that's attached to SRI, which does various other kinds of secret things. It's the only place I've ever worked where there's a document shredder for secure documents, for secret documents, and one for unclassified documents. Anyway, given that over the last 4 years we've seen the number of adjunct faculty positions on average in universities go from 68% to 78%, I think what we're seeing is not a crisis. What we are seeing is the death of a particular kind of career. It is a slow decline, but this is like, the end of an empire. The second thing that I would say, though, is that academia, or the life of the mind, as a form of life, not as is incredibly portable. And it turns out, once you step outside of academia and you learn a couple of things, it turns out to be incredibly lucrative. And I think that what I have discovered in the course of the last 20 years, working in Encyclopedia Britannica as a managing editor, when it was making the transition from being a print publisher to a digital publisher, the last dozen or so years working as a futurist, and then also doing my own more commercial writing, is that, first of all, I think the intellectual challenges and rewards outside the academic world are at least as great as those that you can find on your own, or that you would develop for, if you were doing more straight-on scholarship. The second is that thanks to a variety of structural factors, while academic careers themselves are I think we can see the end point of the kind that we trained for. The kind of permeability of the academic world is such that it is possible to make use of the sorts of resources, particular library resources and so on, that form the kind of marrow of scholarly work. And then finally, there is an immense financial value in what we know and what we know how to do. And that there is a little bit of work that you need to learn how to, stuff you have to kind of learn about yourself and how to translate it. But the work of translating scholarly work for popular or for business audiences turns out to be, I think, intellectually really, really interesting, and more rewarding both kind of cognitively and materially than I think than just about anybody realizes. So I'll stop there.
Hi, my name is Andrew Kinney. I'm a assistant acquisitions editor at Harvard University Press. But despite that title, that's not what I'm going to be talking to you about today. It's my life in publishing, at least not right now. Susan will be giving you all you need to know and probably more about that subject in a few minutes. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about another career path that is open for people who are fugitives, I suppose, from the academic world. And that is prior to my time in grad school, I worked for a company called History Associates, which is a company that does historical research on behalf of various clients for a number of different reasons. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how that works and how to translate the skills that you might have as a historian to be able to take it out into the business world and find a career doing that. I think the biggest difference between what these sorts of companies do and what you might do as a professor. As a professor, you're asked to profess a body of specialized knowledge. But what you do when you work as a researcher at a company is it's about the skills you bring to the table. It's how to research, not what you know. You're going to be asked to do lots of different questions. So you're going to be asked to go about answering different kinds of questions very rapidly. You're going to be asked to say, how do you find out the answer to question X, and how do you find out the answer to question Y? You're not necessarily going to have any familiarity with knowing how to answer those questions from your academic background, but you're going to have a set of skills which allows you to go out and say, how do I then figure out how to answer these kinds of questions? Second, the skill that you're going to need to think a lot about is that you have the ability to know how to organize information. What these companies are doing. So for example, this is probably a better way for me to set it up. There are 4 or 5 types of research that firms like these do. Some are litigation-related research. For example, a group of lawyers on behalf of a client will hire a company to research, for example, who polluted a particular river. And then you go out and say, how do I find out who owned the property near the river? How do I find out what chemicals are going into the river, etc.? Another sort of type of work that these companies often do are organizational histories. NGOs, unions, charities, corporations, different governmental bodies hire companies to go out and either make exhibits, do oral history projects. One of the projects I worked on when I was working for this company was for the International Union of Painters and Allied Trades, who wanted to do an oral history of their southern labor organizers. And so I went to various places in the South and interviewed different labor organizers, and then it became part of their records for historians to use in the future. Another sort of projects that we do is exhibit design and curation, putting together various exhibits for corporate headquarters or museums. There's also some archival work and archival maintenance. And what having a historical background allows you to do is people are going to hire you and say, we want history done. But they're going to have no idea how any of this works. And a lot of things that you take very basically, that you think are very basic and almost seem natural to you, how does one sort out the chaos of the historical record to figure out what happened is actually a tremendous skill that you have to offer people. They're not going to know how this works. They're going to say, find out who polluted this river. They're going to say, tell me, find out the history of our charity. And they're going to say, here are a bunch of boxes. Or they're going to say, I don't even know how to start. But you're going to have the skills to be able to say, well, how would one go about figuring out the answer to this question? I think the biggest difference between doing this kind of work and what most academics are doing is that you need to be much, much more flexible than most academics often are with work. Deadlines matter. You can't go AWOL with a project. You're going to be told, our new project is this. We need to find out what this coal plant was doing. We need to find out what this particular charity was doing between the years 1940 and 1965. You're going to have to figure out how to do it. You're going to need to enjoy the act of researching. I think there are more historians that probably want to admit it that don't like going to the archives, don't like getting down and dirty. But that's what this job is. If that's something you enjoy doing, this may be a career path for you to think about. You're going to need to be able to write clearly and concisely, but you're generally not going to be writing for yourself. And that's a challenge for some people, and it's something to think about. The communication skills that you've learned in graduate school, in your career as a historian, translate quite well. And I know from the work that I did, whether it was talking with people at the company or the various clients that hired us, various organizations we worked with, their consistently impressed with the kind of skills that historians have, the kind of skills that they're looking for. They don't even know that these skills even exist. It hasn't occurred to them that someone would know how to figure out the answers to these questions. And so if that sort of historical detective work is something that appeals to you, this is a kind of career which might work out for you. But I think I'm going to pass it on at this point, but I think that's the main issue that I want to underline, is that is to stop thinking about yourself merely as the knowledge that the particular set of knowledge that you've been told to master, or to stop thinking about yourself as being a product of a particular university or a particular advisor, and think very concretely and discreetly about the skills that you've mastered and the work that you've done.
Thank you all, especially for coming this morning. My name is Susan Ferber, and I'm a history editor at Oxford University Press. I realized as I was going to talk about history today, there were a few other things, more than a few actually, that I did before publishing. And that's sort of bouncing around, and bouncing would indicate that you're going up and like sort of having a positive experience of moving from thing to thing. It was not so much a positive experience for me, but academic administration was a place where I spent some time, and museums as well. And there was a piece that I gave as a talk last winter, and then published about making Plan B into a Plan A life, and realizing that actually coming to what I do now has made me a much happier person than my Plan A of continuing in academia. What I can talk a little bit about, to pick up on this idea of skills, is the kind of skill set for academic publishing and university press publishing in particular. And I know we'll get into questions, and so I want to leave some of those skill questions aside for the moment, but I do think that some broader ones occur to me a lot. I was thinking this morning about personality traits and about the sort of career counseling that I ended up doing, both from my undergraduate institution and privately, because I was so very lost in terms of thinking what real things can I do with my training. And I absolutely was somebody who had been very interdisciplinary, had a very hard time narrowing, had made up an undergraduate degree that was in Victorian and Edwardian studies, which led my father to joke that I could only get a job at Victoria's Secret. I clearly didn't understand anything about art history or science or Karl Marx or any of that sort of stuff that I had spent time doing, or women's history. But I did sort of, at my darkest moments, think maybe he's right, and I'm not really good at retail, so I wonder why that worked. But I do think about this world of sort of being an extrovert and being an introvert, and how many people get into academic life, certainly graduate school, thinking that the immersion in the world of books and in sort of spending time with text as opposed to spending time with people, that there's very much a split personality in terms of becoming the front of a classroom and doing that kind of teaching, and the sort of immersive world of scholarship. And I think a lot of the things that we'll talk about today, not that one can completely break it down into these categories, but which parts of your personality work best with other people, and what parts are things that are very solitary. And I suspect that the writing part and the research part of what the academic training is are many things that people want to continue, and yet many of the careers and the things that we'll talk about are actually about group activities and group orientation, and things that historians perhaps do a lot less of, or are very specific things that are put together to be group projects. The other thing that I was thinking a lot about was this issue of flexibility and not knowing what a given day will look like. How good of a multitasker are you? And to what degree is multitasking something that you thrive on versus something that actually prevents you from feeling like you're making progress on the things that you really want to? This is something that I realize every day when I sit down with a to-do list, how much that doesn't look like what I've done at the end of the day. I think that the degree of stability and knowing in academia, on Wednesdays I teach this, on Thursdays I prep for this, I hope to do my research before 11 p.m. You know, those sorts of questions, I realize I don't have the ability in many ways to control my daily calendar and my to-do list in the way that I sometimes wish I did, which isn't to say that I don't think that issues come up all the time in academia, but you know in a given semester where you're expected to be and when. The other thing, and this is a sort of broader thing, and I will get to much more specifics, I promise, during the roundtable discussion. the degree to which academic calendars shape life and the degree to which in other jobs outside of academia you're not at all a part of that sort of calendarization or the cyclical nature. What I perhaps miss the most, or at least talk about with great nostalgia, is the idea of new beginnings, of September or August being a new beginning, of the blank slate, of the end of the semester, knowing the grades are in, and knowing that you get to start a new class with a new set of people, the sort of regeneration of working with young people. And I think about this a lot because there are days when I realize there's never an end to anything that I do. That even when the book comes out, that is never the end. And I love working with authors, and I love the sort of the life of the book. But I also realize that there are all the other things that are in sort of calendarization, holding patterns that are completely different than that one project. And the idea of the few national holidays we get being the only so-called breaks, and there not being that feeling of beginnings and ends, I think is something to think about with the sort of real jobs outside academia. I will stop there and continue with skill sets, I think, in the roundtable discussion.
Hello, I'm TJ Stiles. I'm very close to the microphone, excuse me. I'm here to speak about writing outside of academia. And so let me just frame it in two ways, put two aspects forward. One is the whole process of creating a writing career outside of academia. And the other is the very different approach you have to take to writing, your different frame of mind of thinking, your approach to what you do, and how it differs from when you're doing academic work. Again, you probably heard this before, but I have to drive home that the idea of going out and writing a bestseller and making $1 million is something I would love to do myself. So it's not easy. I often say that my last book is a monument to the 401k that gave its life so that the book could live. When your financial plan is to win the National Book Award, you know you're in trouble. So, it's obviously something you do because you love, and yet writing careers, any type of writing career, is almost always a patchwork. And you're putting together income from different sources. And I'll get to that in a little bit after I talk about the shaping a writing career and how that can emerge. Now let me just say that I don't advise you to just jump and say, I'm going to go out and be a full-time writer and sort of go leaping off the cliff into this new career. It really needs to emerge out of what you're doing, again, because of the financial realities and also the learning curve that you're on. So let me just tell you, very, very quickly outline my story to give you an idea of how it emerged for me, which I would not recommend as a template for anyone else. I was a colicky baby. No, we'll see. After I finished college, I was looking at graduate schools, and I was accepted and got fellowships from Northwestern and Columbia. And one of the reasons I picked Columbia was not because of the size of the fellowship, but because I actually was thinking, what if this doesn't work out for me? And New York is kind of the ultimate escape hatch. Because it brings you, for me at least, it brought me in connection with sorts of things that I thought might be a good route after this. Now, for example, if you love music, maybe you want to end up at Austin or something, somewhere else. But for me, New York seemed like a good place, not only a good school, not only a historian I wanted to work with, but also it had other options. And I had a very good first year, but my advisor that I was supposed to work with delayed arriving and delayed another year. I got involved in my second year in a year-long court battle with a corrupt landlord who ended up stealing everything I owned. It had some impact on my academic work. I eventually decided I was going to gut it out and get my ABD. My advisor eventually, the guy I went to Columbia to work with, eventually did show up in my third year. By then I was piling up incompletes. It was tough. I was like literally hiding behind hedges rather than see faculty members because I felt so behind. And it was tough. And I managed to push through, but I was burned out. And I was studying British history, interestingly, because now I work in American history. And that had made me a total Anglophobe. And what happened is, so I was kind of getting a little alienated for my subject. So I had actually been working as a temp during the spring break, and I got assigned to a small publishing house, and we were just supposed to, transcribe the British catalog for imports, and I was rewriting the copy, and they hired me as a freelance copywriter. Then they fired me for doing my own work on the clock. I deserved to be fired. And I got hired by Oxford University Press, which back then had a trade marketing department. And so I was able to apply my skills. Somebody who can quickly read a manuscript. I was working with not just American history, but a lot of really great American history. This, for example, is right after James McPherson's Battle Cry Freedom had come out. And there was, as there still is, there's a lot of great American history being published. I was sort of being paid to be a graduate student. It was a lucky break for me that also flowed from my skills. And by the way, they don't have copywriters anymore. They've downsized that marketing department, and all that is freelanced. But it was a way for me to both use my skills to get an education and other things other than British history, and at the same time to make connections. I was actually talking to professors and historians about their manuscripts, about the copy I'd written for the catalog and jacket flaps, and making connections. Another very important thing. Who you know and who you reach out to can be very helpful. And it's amazing how many people were willing to help me out when I started off in my own writing career, to no benefit of their own. And so what happened is that I was also getting an education in the world outside of academia. I was working in publishing. And then after Oxford, I went to work at a very commercial press at Valentine Books, where I was copy chief for advertising. And so I was then moving more and more, and of course through my professional connections in the publishing world, getting into the world of publishing, and rather than seeing books as kind of the expression of academic work, understanding and getting more in touch with the literary values, with the commercial marketplace, writing marketplace, with the expectations and working inside of a commercial house of how they think of books, how they talk about them. Like when I sell a book, how is that editor going to pitch it to the rest of the company? Understanding how a book proposal is put together. Getting comfortable with the world of agents, which a lot of academics are very nervous about. And in fact, you cannot publish. If you publish a book with a commercial house without an agent, first of all, it's like a virgin birth. It's amazing. It really should go into scripture. Second of all, you're probably unlike the Virgin Mary getting screwed. So, this is something you've got to learn about how to, you've got to learn, you've got to be comfortable with it. You've got to be comfortable with rejection. You've got to learn what it is they expect. You've got to learn that world of expectations outside of publishing. And then how did I start? Well, I literally, because Oxford back then was in the same building with Putnam Berkeley, which is now part of Penguin. I actually made friends with somebody who was an executive and acquired a few books a year. And we were pals, and he said, well, I'll tell you what, why don't you do this small anthology for me, which we'll publish as a mass market, and just because I'm interested in that. And then he said, well, what else are you interested in doing? So I kind of expanded it, and I said, well, let's do these they're original paperbacks, they were small books, small print runs. But let's do a narrative anthology where you kind of get a narrative history of a period in American history with my connecting narrative and with first-person accounts. So it was low pressure. I actually worked without an agent, so I had a lousy contract. But I got experience in the whole publishing process at a commercial house. It taught me about how to structure a book. It gave me a chance to write, but again, at limited length. And then when I was ready to really do a major book, he said, okay, now you need to get an agent. So I got help, again. And I also got help from academic historians who I'd made contacts with, and were very helpful. And if you want to go and try something that's outside of academia but relates to it, reach out to people you've never heard of. They're helpful. People often are willing to help you out, both inside publishing and in academia. But at the same time, and again, I realize we've all been going on, each of us too long. When you write a book, again, just like when you write an academic work, you're thinking about the audience. It's an audience of peers when you write an academic work. You're writing for your profession, and you are meeting the expectations of that profession. When you are writing even a serious work with that that relies on and produces new knowledge, relies on scholarship, you are writing for a general audience when you write a commercial book. And your loyalty has to be first and foremost to the writing. And you have to start thinking like a writer. You have to be a writer. You have to understand that when you present contextual information, it has to serve the purpose of the narrative. It cannot be dead freight on a raft. It has to be part of the propulsion mechanism. You have to give the reader a reason to keep reading every page. Sometimes when I've had friends who are academics, they say, I've got this work, you know, I think it could reach a large audience because I've got little vignettes, little interesting stories I'm dropping in. I never read that stuff when I read a book. You know, the little sidebar things. It's just stuff that's candy that's thrown in, you know, thinking that that will turn this into a wonderful meal. No. You have to give the reader a reason to turn every page. Everything has to serve the larger narrative. You have to think like a writer. You have to write like somebody who loves writing, who loves language, and isn't trying to show that you understand, you know, how to use the lingo that's expected, perhaps properly, of an academic profession. And it's possible, but it's difficult, to bring together scholarship with writing, to have literary values and scholarly values. And if you produce a work that is solid, but also is well written, is a pleasure to read, you have to love books to write this way, but also says something new and interesting to the world. Basically, what you do when you write for a large audience is you tell them what they don't know about what they know. Right? That's why so many books come out about the same people, because they are iconic people, they speak to a large audience. And you go from thinking like a beginning academic, where you're like, I have to go deep on this small subject, narrow and deep. And you actually have to think like somebody who's had tenure for 20 years, I want to write it big. I want to talk about what, in my case, America means. You have to think on a large scale. And you have to say, iconic subjects are not selling out. That's speaking to a large audience about what is meaningful to them, and then telling them something they don't know. So there's a lot of different ways in which you take your skills, but then you have to also fill a new role. But it's very difficult to do this and make a living. Again, if you start to do it full time, it's because it's emerging out of what you're also doing. Those anthologies, I did one a year while I was working full time, and also teaching karate, and had my own hobbies on the side. So I was single, I had no kids, I had no obligations. It's easier if you have a spouse with health insurance. It's difficult. But if it emerges out of an existing career, it's really the way to go. And the last thing I want to say is I still put together income from other sources. I still do freelance work actually for Oxford University Press, doing what I did 20 years ago. And that brings in some income, which is important in my income picture. And that's a classic writer's world, where you're patching together income from different sources. So I will now relinquish my.
Let's open it up. Does anybody have any questions that they're ready to ask?
Hi. So I'm actually a person who wants to do everybody else's plan B. And one of the things that I find most difficult is this question of the academic calendar, because I don't know when one person should or should not apply for jobs based on when I plan to finish, right? So that I know next year is going to supposedly be my last year, and I hope to defend and be done with my dissertation, but that doesn't mean that a whole slew of jobs will be open for me come May or June that I can then apply for. So I was wondering if you guys could speak to just how these outside jobs can work or correlate with the academic calendar.
Sure. Also, for sort of things like sort of consulting and strategy work, there is no calendar. It just comes open when it's open, right? So, and you can decide for yourself whether you feel like this is, you could conceivably finish the last chapter while you are, training to put it in this new gig or not. But the other thing to keep in mind is that the kind of rhythm of it is that the decisions happen, the positions come open and often get filled very quickly. So, it's not that something will come open and it will be filled for the next year. Positions available, if there's a project going on, within 2 weeks, it can be that sort of, you're packing your bags and, moving to Dallas or whatever. So, also keep that, keep that piece in mind as well.
I guess one thing that, I hope that we get into, and I guess I want to answer this, maybe not exactly directly, is the degree to which I think it makes sense to do research on careers while in academia. In a sense, you have some form of healthcare, some sort of schedule, a schedule that probably has more flexibility than working a 9-to-5 job, and the ways in which that if you're thinking something's out there, something would make me happier, there are blue skies, learning about what that is, the very specific nitty-gritty day-to-day stuff of that job makes a great deal of sense while you are doing something else. I know that finding time for internships, job shadowing, information interviewing, I always thought I don't have time for that while I'm in school. I can't possibly do that and do all my reading this week. But it does strike me that it's what I spent most of my time doing while trying to figure out what else I might be able to do or what might be a good fit. And I realized that drawing on alumni networks, drawing on the sort of cohort ahead and other things, people that you do not know but that the universities give you access to and at least sort of built-in networks, and this is maybe one of the things that career centers are best at least keeping track of some people. That it's not a set of information, of interviewing like with paralegal jobs or with consulting firms where people come in and it's a set day, but rather making connections with some people who maybe the only connection is they went to the same school, but that may be enough. They're at least willing to talk about what they do. And I think it means drawing on some of the skills as, let's say, oral history is the best one I can think of, even though it's not necessarily coming up with a full set of questions and having to tape them, but rather thinking about the ways that you would ask to elicit the information that you need to decide if this is something that's a fit. I think the information interviewing I did was critical. It ended up landing me no job, which was not at all the purpose, but I think what really did give me a sense of what makes other people happy in their jobs. What does a day on this job look like? And job shadowing, while I didn't do a lot of it, at least I had a sense of what the pattern was. It was something that I could see myself fitting. And internships, I realized that a lot of the work is kind of boring, kind of tedious, and certainly the kind of work that someone's just waiting to have a body who can get it done. But that defines a lot of the entry-level parts of a lot of jobs, including the publishing job that I ended up getting. But having that sense of you're willing to put yourself forward, willing to take the time to learn something that's not about a certificate or a degree, but rather just fulfilling the purpose. And a lot of times interns are the very first people to get considered when they've done a good job for a paid position. I know it doesn't always happen, but I do think that showing that willingness is absolutely a good way of both sides getting something out of the arrangement. You learn if this is a culture that you fit, if this is a place where you can actually take away a skill set and at least be able to show there is something besides writing papers, writing a dissertation, and all the things that a CV for academia might look like they have one direct route. Being able to say, these are direct things I've done, this has produced X for a company, and in those ways, sort of thinking about where your value is in terms of getting a project done, I think can be very valuable. I absolutely recommend doing this while in school. I think it fits the academic calendar relatively well in terms of breaks between terms, in terms of the schedule of set numbers of weeks, and knowing I am available during these dates. And very often that means something that will fit a company that maybe you decide, I really hate this, but at least that tells you something about that not being necessarily the dream.
I have a question about writing styles a little bit. In there. During my thesis, I'm writing my dissertation now, and during the dissertation writing time, I find that you're very directed to a very specific kind of language and a very specific kind of writing. In my personal life, I've actually written a fictional book. I haven't sent it to publishers or anything.
It's a book of fiction, or it's an imaginary book?
It's a book of fiction. I haven't sent it out because I'm not sure I want to publish it because I am aiming for academia, but writing is something I love. I've been writing since I was 12. I've won awards for my writing when I was a kid in school. And so writing is actually quote-unquote plan B, although I plan to write on the side of my academia job in my perfect little world. So my question to you is, can you marry, it doesn't need to be a different writing style, can you marry the two different writing styles, you know, academia writing and non-academic writing? Are they compatible, or do you really need to focus on one style of writing or the other?
Well, what sort of works do you mean? I mean, if you're talking about fiction, then I would say, you know, a work of fiction should definitely not be written in an academic style at all, unless it's a parody of academia, which, you know, everybody enjoys actually. But for that, you know, you can just probably pull academic works off the shelf, and that you don't have to change anything. You know, seriously, you know, you have to look at the purpose you're serving. If you're talking about writing a trade book, and of course, those who don't know, trade in publishing means, you know, general audience work, but it's a work of serious nonfiction, then you can write a serious book. It doesn't have to be dumbed down. The minute you think that you're changing the level of kind of intellectual, I hate to use this word even though it's an old one, discourse, the minute you're starting to feel like you're deliberately bringing yourself down, no, then you're in huge trouble. But there's a gigantic difference between writing for an academic audience that has these, you know, you're writing to a group of peers who are having this conversation about something that's very important. And you know, the academic works, scholarly monographs, they're the building blocks of the professional knowledge, which is important for, you know, the larger culture. But it doesn't mean they actually have to digest it. The academics digest it for them. And so it's fine that your thesis is, you know, in terms of the rest of your writing or anything you do outside, it's fine that that's what it is. You know, you're taking part in this very technical conversation. But when you then address a larger audience, you know, you have to write clearly, you have to write compellingly, you have to write in a way that the books that you admire, that you would seek to emulate, write. And you know, there's, again, you know, you come back to one of the classic essays on writing, which is George Orwell's Politics in the English Language, when he says, you know, when you start to write in phrases, and at the time he was making fun of what seems like a quaint academic writing now, and he says your phrases do your thinking for you. And when you write for, you're really worried about writing, you're thinking about every word and its impact, and that is, if you do that properly, that is a pesticide that kills off academic jargon, because they can't survive that. If you're really thinking about clarity in writing and powerful evocative writing, and you know, just plain old clarity, then an audience that's not taking part in a technical conversation, you know, that writing won't survive into that other sphere. So I think absolutely it can serve. There are many examples of this, and I think history is actually remarkable for its ability to produce very good writers who spent their careers in academia. And personally, I think it's because, you know, traditionally, you know, writing follows a chronological arc. A narrative is ultimately a chronological arc. Ian Forster said even modernist non-chronological writing is still pegged to that chronology. And history is about, you know, time. And we can't escape individuals, and people are interested in human beings. And no offense to science writing, but you know, I mean, even thematic writing, the characters and human beings are very important. And so historians, often without any training, the history tends to produce good writers. Now that doesn't mean on a consistent basis, but it has produced many good writers without any specific training. So, so it's absolutely possible to do both.
Can I build on this?
Yeah.
So, okay. I mean, I recently went through the process of getting an agent and doing a trade book, and here are the galleys, and it'll be out in August. And my experience, so sort of what I have found is, I think, a couple critical things. And one of them is that the two, first of all, at one point, my editor sort of looked at one of the drafts and said, you know, sort of, you're talking about this person's work and this person's work and so forth. The reader doesn't want that. The reader wants to know what you think. And that was an incredibly clarifying and challenging and liberating moment, because a huge amount of what I did as an academic, and some of this was because I was kind of overtrained, was that I was brilliant at sort of constructing like these elaborate fortresses of footnotes and sort of caveats about, well, you know, these people say this, and the annals school does this, and this other tradition takes this position. And, you know, I could go on for quite a while without ever nailing myself down to a particular position. As a futurist, that is, you do nothing but that. With this book, on the other hand, sort of, I had to believe every single word. I mean, you know, it had to be sort of what I thought. And that is phenomenally clarifying. The other thing is, no footnotes. Or if there's a whole category of work, or you know, there's the whole category of the thing that feels like writing, which is, you know, you go to JSTOR and you find like 2 more citations. I mean, of course, none of you ever do this. I'm the only one who ever like pads this stuff out. But you can't, you know, there's none of that. Absolutely none of it. And so that is, you know, again, what it, on an everyday basis, sort of, yes, you have to deal with the existential terror of producing words now, as opposed to just generating footnotes. But ultimately, it's good. The last thing is, you know, sort of treat it like work. And or if you have, now, when I was in graduate school, when I was sort of doing more academic stuff, you know, I tended to kind of enact this sort of, you know, brilliant genius thing of waiting until the last minute, and then this incredible flurry of inspiration, it all pours out, right? With this, I won't say I got up at 5 a.m. every morning. I'll say I set the alarm for 5, and there's this long process of waking up. But I had, you know, I set 1,000 words a day, and you know, and you just get up and you start writing, and sometimes, and in the course of writing, as often as not, finishing a thought you had begun working on the night before, finishing a sentence or a paragraph, getting back into it, or you start having the ideas. You know, it's not that the muse strikes and then you write; it's that you write and then the muse strikes. So, you know, and I think the last thing is that you're absolutely right that you have learned a particular way, a particular mode of writing and production that correlates to a particular kind of self-presentation, professional identity, blah, blah, blah. Having said that, you now know how to learn those, and you can now learn another one. So, you know, sort of the way you're writing now, or learning to write now, is not the way you have to write for the whole rest of your life.
Yeah, and I would just add, first of all, I totally agree. Writer's block is for amateurs.
Yeah.
You know, and every piece of writing is, if it's any good, is the product of endless rewriting. But I would also say, you know, that different types of writing, there is no, you know, this is a trade book or this is general audience writing. I mean, there's whatever it is, what it needs to be. You know, for example, my books do it. They have lots of footnotes. But there are footnotes that sort of establish my sources, so the reader, when I write a highly detailed narrative, I want professionals to be able to double check me. I want buffs to be able to double check me. I want the reader to know the authority. I relegate any arguing that I do for almost overwhelmingly to the footnotes. I don't do much of that, but to the endnotes I will still do it. But you know, that's because I'm writing, you know, to use the term loosely, definitive biographies about major figures. You know, this is something people want in that. On the other hand, there's lots of writing that does not need endnotes. Or, you know, I think about 2 biographies that I've reviewed in the last year or 2. One was a biography that, what's his name, Jeffrey Ward wrote of his great-grandfather, who was the guy who swindled Ulysses S. Grant. And this is a guy who's built a career outside of academia as a historian. He's like the screenwriter for, he's a good writer, and he's a screenwriter for Ken Burns and whatnot. And his great-grandfather was the guy who swindled President Grant after, so he finally wrote this family story. And I thought it was great, I really enjoyed it. And it didn't delve into historical you know, themes, and it was very much this story of this life. And when I reviewed Ron Chernow's Life of Washington, which won the Pulitzer Prize, I really liked it, and I hardly begrudged it getting the prize. But you know, I thought writing-wise, he got lazy in a lot of places, and I criticized it for cliches and dead phrases and things that, if he's writing at that level, he shouldn't be doing. And if he also, he sort of ignored a lot of the historiography in a way that I think obscured understanding this person. Now, his responsibility, to my mind, as writing a sort of definitive biography, but for a large audience, wasn't to get bogged down in historiographical arguments, but his lack of understanding of the historiography turned, for example, George Washington into kind of a spendthrift who loved luxury instead of somebody who came out of a society that expected a public leader to be a man of leisure, et cetera. I mean, his lack of historiographical background weakened his portrait that was on the page. So, but I didn't criticize this other book for that because that wasn't that sort of criticism wouldn't apply. In other words, there's no specific rule you should follow as long as it serves the purpose of the writing you're doing and works for your audience. You always have to think about your audience. It's got to work for them. It's never about you. I mean, it's about you because you're interested in it and you want to do it. But it's in the end, it's about the work, and the work changes. It depends.
Yeah. So I have a practical question about these sorts of jobs, particularly the type that Andrew was mentioning, but the others of you can chime in as well. So first of all, how does one go about locating jobs of interest of this type? And second of all, what are the elements of a good cover letter, and how do you rearrange your CV away from the academic genre to this sort of historical detective work?
I think there are a number of different places that you can look for jobs like these. I mean, there are a couple big firms. History Associates is one, History Company is another. There are another, and there are more coming up yearly. There also are people working independently as consultants who are doing this sort of thing. And there are all people in-house working for large law firms that do this kind of work. I don't know that there's anything spectacularly innovative that you need to do to sell yourself. Most of the people who work at these companies have been at least tangentially related to the academic world. A lot of them wanted to leave it, soured on it for some reason. It didn't present them the kind of challenge or lifestyle that they were looking for. And so you find a lot of people with PhDs who decided not to go into academia, ABD, with masters, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I don't know that there's any specific active translation that would be necessary. I got the job, it's a very banal story. They sent an advertisement to the history department at my undergraduate institution, so they're looking for people to fill this job. I sent in a letter saying, probably very boringly saying, I like history here, I'll come do the job. And they called me up and went in for an interview. And the whole, basically it was, the one comment that I really remember from it is, what was useful is actually they brought a copy of my undergraduate thesis to basically show I did some research. And then I remember one of the executives there telling me, well, we're going to have to change this from race, class, gender to coal, oil, and steel or something like that. Because there's different kinds of questions that people were looking at in a lot of the work they were doing. But I don't think there's any real trick. I think the best way to do it, and there are also similar kinds there are people working in public history jobs for the federal government or state governments that had very similar career paths. I think the best thing to do is to, talk to the alumni at the university and find out if there's anyone who's worked with them. More people have than you realize. I've seen proposals coming in to Harvard University Press and I've say, oh, this person who we're signing up actually worked with the same company I did 3 years after I did. There's more people out there than you realize. And just try to look out and find people and just send them an email and say, this is something I'm interested in. They're people who have left, I think, the academic career behind are always eager to help out other people who are thinking about doing the same thing because they see that you're struggling with a lot of the same issues that they were struggling with. And although this moment may feel different, it may feel like more of a crisis, as we've been talking about that's the case, the existential crises have always been there. And, there's always been, that kind of question in people's mind. Is this the right path? The opportunity costs feel very great at this stage, making the right decision. I would say talk to some people and see what their job is like, because you'll find that there's a lot of different kinds of work that people are doing. and some of the companies may be a better fit for you than others. But I mean, this is very banal advice, but that's
looking for connections and getting looking for models and contacting people. Yeah.
But I would say on the cover letter front, I realize that the worst letters that I see when I'm looking at job applications are the ones that say, I majored in such and such, my thesis or dissertation is on this. And here's what I argue, that it's no longer about writing for an audience. The audience is the person who's hiring, and taking the sort of very, very basic building blocks of the things you do well and saying how those will serve the needs of the company or the needs of the person hiring very specifically. And I think much more about the skills of the organization. You know, I realize they become very trite when you see them over and over, but show how you are good at working in details. Show how you are organized, and there are different ways of doing that. I was told, and I choose to believe this, that the thing that distinguished me as an editorial assistant candidate after going to about 10 months of interviews for editorial assistant jobs, for the one person who decided to hire me, was that I had worked at a museum as a curatorial intern, organizing a hat collection of thousands of items of hats and gloves. Did I ever think that would be the thing that for a publishing job would have been it? No, but it was very much about the willingness to do something that seems incredibly time-consuming, to some people quite boring, certainly esoteric, and to say, you're willing to do this. This is the thing that will propel you through the number of hours of things that will, quite frankly, be very boring and involve a lot of pieces of technology that you never thought you would spend as much time doing. You know, scanning, photocopy, and very, very, very basic things, filing. But the willingness and the enthusiasm to do a lot of things that may seem like, oh, I could have done that without a college degree. I think it is compelling to a company. I think somebody who is active and problem solving and can show that skill, not I did this research on X, but the ways in which you can break down what that actually required. I think working with people is really underestimated. If you were advising in your dorm, you actually have a role where you have told people, you know, or heard their problems and at least figured out the next step, maybe that they could do, maybe successfully or not, but in many ways, jobs that you're going into that are entry level, and don't believe that you're not starting at entry level just because you have an advanced degree in something or you were long into doing something that would be an advanced degree, that you're going to have to help problem solve all the time in ways that I think we underestimate the extracurricular activities and the skills we gain from those, and I think that's kind of stuff that when you step back to look at a resume and to look at a cover letter and to put that together with what a company needs, that you're trying to say the ways in which you can match what they want, and I think that's the selling aspect that I would most recommend.
Can I speak to the resume thing? Like, first of all, okay, the first important thing is practice calling it resume rather than CV. The second is that because a lot of companies now use automated services or look through Monster or other job boards, the structure of the resume is now so deep, is now so incredibly well worked out because you've got bots rolling at keywords and doing semantic analysis and stuff that it makes the Japanese tea ceremony look like the last night of Burning Man. Okay. Fortunately, there are books that will explain how, what kinds of phrases you want to include and so forth. And then the other, I think that the most shocking piece of advice I got about crafting resumes was someone who looked at mine and said, you've got all these publications on here, and we don't want to know what you've written. We want to know who you are. And it took me several seconds to realize that for years I had thought that what I had written was who I was, or this is who I am. And it speaks to the fact that there is a certain amount of craft work you've got to do when you're reimagining yourself. That there is no longer an important distinction to be made between you, mid-19th century cultural historian of the Ohio Valley, and those idiots who are doing late 19th century political history of the Tennessee Valley. Those are losers. No, I mean there was a little bit of unlearning of habits that you acquire in the academic job market that you have to kind of cast aside. But you learn one system, you can learn the next one.
Yeah, and that's that idea of unlearning. I think that's very important. I would also say one more thing, which is actually kind of speaks to what Susan's been saying, which is it reminds me, thinking about branching out into other careers or trying to find some other possibilities. It reminds me of the advice that on finding a spouse that Calvin Trillin dispenses. You wouldn't know him. He's an amusing writer for the general audience. He's not a historian, but he's very funny. He said the best thing to do is go to the right party. And of course, that's how do you know it's going to be the right party? And yet, so much of what happens in life is a result of accident, by being in the right place, by who you run up against. Again, like my life course was, even though I ended up doing a version of what I had set out to do, which is working with history. And I actually, even though I try very hard to write very scholarly, stuff that's very solid in the scholarly sense, I actually don't call myself a historian, because I call myself a biographer, because I'm trying to marry these other things. But anyway, even though I ended up being basically in a similar position to where I wanted to be at the beginning, and to some extent, it was kind of the accident of place made a big difference. So I went to New York. Again, it doesn't have to be New York, but for me that was a decisive thing. I was going out and leaving academia and working as a temp, and that put me in a lot of different spots. And one of them was at a publishing company. And then that led to another possibility. And then that led to me meeting people who then opened up my future elsewhere. And that just because a job is, entry level, don't necessarily think only about the job. Think about where you want to be and sort of what possibilities you want to open up for you. Because, all of the great people in anything started off as nothing somewhere. There's a friend of mine who he's now he's now head of McSweeney's, but he's going to be editorial director at Grey Wolf Press. He was editor at Farrar, Straus, Giroux. And when we knew each other, I was lucky to have an office. It was a window office. The window had been bricked over. I was making about $20,000 a year. He was making less. He was answering phones and publicity. And now, he was in the right place. He went into the publishing industry. He made connections. People he knew helped him guide him forward. Well, possibilities opened up, and he rose up. And he loves books. He loves literature, and he's at the center of it because he put himself in kind of the place where he wanted to be, even though he didn't want to do publicity. He didn't want to answer phones. He actually, at that time, wanted to ski mostly. And yet he put himself in contact with the people he wanted to meet up with. The kind of the place, the cultural place, the kind of business space that met who he was and where he wanted to go. Now, I'm not telling you all to run out and be publishing interns, or, there's all kinds of possibilities that are opening up in our new world. We have this new digital landscape in which things are changing very fast, and you have to think creatively. But again, coming into contact with thinking about where you want to be, I think, is very important.
Yeah, I worry a little bit that we've made this sound like publishing is the answer for
Yeah,
all of this.
yeah.
And I definitely want to dispel you of any notions. We haven't mentioned, for instance, business, finance, or thank goodness you brought up digital, because I do think this is an important thing.
And but whatever happens, stay away from journalism. That ship is
You've
sink.
touched on this. You've touched on this a little bit, but I wonder if the panel could speak to the differences in culture that are cultivated within the academic setting versus outside. I work for a corporation, and a lot of times the mindset that comes from people straight out of the academic world is very hard to fit into the goals, and it's hard for them to get their minds around that this other organization has very different goals and objectives, and how academia might alter its own way of training, teaching, and opening up people's minds to some other opportunities. One question that came up earlier about how do you adapt your resume and things like that. Be aware. The work, get to know these corporations that you might be applying with, because if I'm advertising a job for a corporate archivist and you send me 10 pages single-spaced on all the publications you've done, that's not a very smart move. Obviously, you're not going to be sitting in my archives writing articles, you know.
Do you want a chair up here? Because that's great. I said, do you want to take a chair up here? Because that was really well said. I think that's a good, I don't know if I can add to that.
First of all, I think that there's a lot of different cultures within corporations, right? You know, if you're working in HR versus legal versus, you know, sort of systems administrator, whatever. And I worked for several years in Encyclopedia Britannica, which was kind of a cross, it was part Shadowlands, part Glengarry Glen Ross. And sort of, you know, this incredibly aggressive sort of marketing and sales group. And the guys who actually did the, you know, the actual publishing of the books, who had all, you know, played football at St. Ignatius and done 2 tours at NAM. And, you know, they thought of the encyclopedia as 44 million words that had to go in 19 volumes. And it was completely different from sort of the way that the editors thought about it. So I think but, you know, sort of, it is, yeah, you have to adapt yourself, but it's not a bad, you know, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But yes, you are going to have to do it.
What advice would you give to the academy to broaden?
I wouldn't. I mean, I think it's frankly, I think it's a lost cause. No, honestly, no, seriously. Academic sort of universities have been, you know, 20 years ago, I was doing stuff with foundations about how to change graduate education. We've known about this problem for, you know, the physics market collapsed 40 years ago. And fundamentally, it has not changed. Sort of, physics graduate school is still, if you get a tenure track job, it is a reflection of the success of the program. If you don't get a tenure track job, even if you're going to a hedge fund and you're making $10 million a year, it's because you personally have failed. And I think that universities, that for better or worse, have done a phenomenal job of publicizing, of taking credit for certain kinds of career successes, which is essentially replication, and consigning everything else to, you know, well, we thought they were smart. I'm sorry, you know what? You're not and I think you're not betraying, you know, you're not betraying your advisor unless they actually offer you a job and you turn it down. You know, that's the only circumstance under which your peers can make any sort of moral claim about the worthiness of what you've chosen to do. So I think it's just if it hasn't happened in 2 generations, I don't think it's going to happen within the next 2. So
let me just add that I don't agree.
Good. Okay. Yes. Why am I wrong?
I think that I think that you're absolutely right about that there are some advisors, many, who see it as a failure if their students don't get tenure track positions. I do think that the academy has changed to a certain degree, where in my own department, we certainly, as a whole, feel like it's a great success if a student gets a position like a position as a CIA analyst. Although politically, some of us may disagree, but we consider that a great success. If TJ were from our department and winning a Pulitzer Prize, yeah, I think we'd think that was an incredible success. So I don't think it's quite as cut and dry as all that. At the same time, I do think that there are certainly many advisors who would say, "Oh yeah, you're not going for a tenure track job. Well, I'm shoving you to the side."
Do you think this issue of culture is the one that as a historian, you're thrown into the deep understanding of a different time, a different place, a different set of values, different sets of personalities and priorities, and if nothing else, I think that's actually pretty good training for being in a corporate culture or trying to figure out a new culture. I mean, I realize anthropology might put you in like sort of an equal setting, but this is the thing that that I actually worry less about with historians and some others. I mean, the fact that it's living in the present versus sort of understanding the past, I'm not sure that there's as much of a difference there.
Yeah, and I also think that graduate education should definitely prepare students for the fact that a very large percentage of them will not get the classic tenure track job in their field. I mean, just, you know, the job market is lousy, and so you should be prepared for that. On the other hand, you know, I'm not one of those writers outside of academia who belittles and mocks everything academia does. There's this kind of ridiculous tension between people who write for a general audience and people who write for other historians. Academics exist because it's there to create specialized knowledge, and that's good. I mean, that's fine. You know, I don't think academics have to stop writing for each other and stop producing monographs, or stop, you know, arguing with each other and having this kind of internal culture that's separate from the larger culture. That's actually fine. That's specialization, that's professionalization. That's what made America great, damn it. But it does exist within this larger world. And so rather than saying, you know, oh, they're all so stupid that everything they're doing is wrong, just preparing students for, you know, the fact that they should be aware and prepared for other careers, to have a better understanding of how their culture actually does contrast with the business and commercial culture they're in. I mean, even in publishing, which again is not the answer. Okay, maybe for some of you, but it's not by any means the general answer. But if you're going to succeed in publishing, you've got to have a sense of, let's say you're a nonfiction editor. Let's say you're you. You have to have a sense of what good writing is. You have to have a sense of the state of knowledge in the fields you publish, and that your book is saying something important and that's kind of newsworthy, even if it's just on the cultural pages of the book review. And at the same time, you've got to understand your business. You've got to understand that, okay, 70% of books that get published lose money. So I've got to be able to control my costs, and I've got to be able to make the most out of those 30% that make money. And that you've got to be able to work the P&L, you know, understand what the profit and loss statement, you know, how that fits into the larger picture of what you're publishing. You're investing money when you acquire a book. You know, you're on the hook for your company. So even a person who's at that nexus of the cultural and scholarly values and literary values with a corporation, they've got to be a business person. And they're held accountable if they don't make money. And that's the thing where I think that, you know, it's important. And again, you know, like, I'm not saying that all of academia turns its nose on that, but I think that is an important thing for academia.
You know, if you want to go this route, though, I think one of the most valuable things you can do if you want to write is to get an agent. I mean, it is unbelievable.
They will educate you.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, or to think of a literary agent as a PhD advisor who only gets paid if you get a job. That clarify things? I mean, they know the market. You know, they know editors. They will sort of help shape your proposal. They will get it to people, and sort of just, you know, sort of find when you trust them and do everything they tell you to do.
But you know, at the same time, you know, just like in that specific case of an agent, how do you get one?
Yeah.
Well, you have to read books you have to read books of the sort of type you would like to read.
Mm-hmm.
You're right to write, and then you understand, find out. You just call up the publishing house and find out who represents that person. They'll tell you. You know, you find out who the agents are of people. Well, the same thing. You know, like if you're interested in different fields, you just start doing your homework. Start finding out. Who is getting hired to do this kind of work in different places. I mean, you've got to think about what it is you see out there that appeals to you, and you've got to research it and connect yourself to that. So, wait, there was a question over here.
Yeah.
His arm got tired.
So lots of exciting career possibilities that the panel's been discussing. I wonder how important is graduate education to, you know, making yourself available to these career fields? Because my particular background is I have a BA, and right now I work as a journalist for a small nonprofit. As you say, journalism, it's, you know, the writing is on the wall there as well. And so right now I'm considering sort of graduate education, but I wouldn't be going for, you know, I agree with what you said, sir. I mean, it's sort of a done deal. The tenure track is not a viable career option, certainly not a path into the middle class. But at the same time, it seems as if because there are so many other people who do have their PhDs or their MAs who are going on to the non-academic job market in the history of various other cultural fields. I mean, is it really still important to have your advanced degree?
Do it for love. Seriously. No, and that's the best reason.
Yeah, I mean, the statistics are terrible. You look at the demographically, income goes up with each level of graduate education until PhD, and then it goes down. So it's tough. You've got to really love it. And like I said, doing what I do, I'm at a point now where, at least for the moment, I'm stable. I still patch together income, but I did it in my last book. I said, okay, either this is a book that's going to make my career, or it's going to be my last chance to do this. I mean, that's kind of the fatalism that propelled me into it. I loved doing it. I believed in what I could do, and yet at the same time, you don't get a PhD because that's your business strategy. I mean, like, you do it because you love it, and you can always bail out. I mean, I hate to give that advice to graduate students. Just have your hand around the ripcord. But it's true. I mean, I went ABD, and my graduate education was very valuable. It wasn't all of the education I needed, but for what I ended up doing, it did. It wasn't it. The understanding the importance of really understanding what have other people said. Of what is the context that you're missing. I mean, there are all kinds of things that I learned. That I was then kind of enriched me and allowed me to do other things. But I didn't need that PhD. I mean, now I still have people come up to me and say, well, why didn't you get your PhD? Well, I never started it. I just started work on the proposal when I bailed out. I said, that's like saying, you got a college degree, why don't you just get a law degree? You're so close. It's only 3 years away. I mean, forget it. So for me now, it's irrelevant. Even though, that's very much the world I'm engaged with, serious professional history. I'm very much engaged with the field. But for me, it's not necessary. And so, it's not like you're locked in a train that is not stopping until it gets to the end. You can stop with an MA, you can stop with an ABD, you can be halfway through your dissertation, and you know what? You see a job you like, and you can stop. I mean, it is possible, but that takes a degree of self-knowledge, and you also have to understand how much do I love this, how important it is to me, and how. But like I said, there's that realism you have to bring in, which is why you're all here. The fact that there are a lot more PhDs produced than there are tenure-track jobs in your field. So.
Hi. I wanted to get back to what Susan was saying about entry-level jobs, and I was wondering if you actually see a lot of PhDs applying for jobs that just require a BA, perhaps. And I also had another question. Would you advise looking for jobs that ask for experience in certain things like archive management or public history, if you don't have any experience in that, but you have a PhD in history? Well, for everyone.
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that up. I think there are large numbers of people who have gained specific sets of expertise. If that's something that you're thinking about, seriously thinking about archival skills, at the very least, you've got to be in an archive, not just requesting the materials, but learning about the sort of systems management that requires. I think otherwise it's throwing away, whether it's electronic or paper, it's throwing away opportunities of not optimizing the match. I'm someone who thought a lot about libraries and archives, spent time working in an archive, thinking, do I want to do that? It's a part-time degree, it's 2 years, should I do this? Is this where I want to end up? I suspect if you were to apply for something that asked for and you're not giving them, you're not going to get that call, you're not going to get that email. It would be miraculous. This question though about PhDs applying for jobs that are BA required, absolutely, I see it all the time. But I also think it is about saying why you are the best person for the job, and in terms of selling yourself, about saying, it wasn't a mistake what I did. You're not walking into a situation, as I often felt inside my head, saying, I feel like a real failure in this whole academic world. Like I walked away from it, I'm just such a loser at doing this, or denigrating what that experience was. It is a time to actually project what those specific things that make you the best qualified person. And I do think it's what's taking away from the experience of, and I think you're absolutely right, I think walking away, but being able to say, I'm ashamed of walking away. Walking away is just a way of getting away from debt or away from an advisor I don't like, but rather, what is it that I've taken away from this and can translate for this person who's doing it?
In corporate consulting, a PhD is experience.
I think you also need to remember that depending on what field you're going into, people aren't going to know what to make necessarily of your academic experience. And so there will be some misconceptions and some things you might need to battle, but it's also an opportunity for you to say why what you've done makes you the right fit for what you're doing. I think you'll see that if someone says, well, why did you get this PhD, or why were you ABD, why didn't you finish your PhD, or whatever your particular path is, it's not going to be intuitive to a lot of people why you've taken the path you've taken. But I think the important thing is, as Susan was saying, is to let people know that it is a path, that this was a choice that you've made. Certainly, when I went into publishing after I didn't finish my PhD and I went into publishing, that was something that was useful for me to describe to people, to say this was the path that I took, this is why I'm here, this is why I want this job, this is why I think I'll be a good person for this job, and so here's the experience I have. And I think there can be a temptation in some fields to look at it as education, not experience. But I think it can be an opportunity for you to say, as tough as it can be, to keep your chin up about it, but to say, this is experience, and use specifics to show why it's experience, to say what it is you've done. I know when I was interviewing for the job that I have now, a lot of talking about the specific kind of editorial work I did as a graduate student, I think was very important. And the way that I talked about it was very important in convincing people that I would be the right person in the position that I had, even though I had no previous publishing experience. So I think the idea of people saying you see the ads, experience necessary, and that sort of thing, that is something you'll need to battle against. We need to try to find a way to package what you've done and say this is alternative experience that counts and it's meaningful. They may not believe you, but if you do it enough times, I think that hopefully it will be successful.
You may have to concoct an answer to the inevitable question, where do you see yourself in 10 years? I eventually learned to stop saying firing you. But it's a preposterous question, and here you are, you're like, oh God, I have a PhD and I'm applying for this level of position. Now I've got to concoct an imaginary career path for myself, so, which is why mine always ended up with firing the person who's hiring me.
But we are not the only people who have made career changes, right? And the HR people who are the recruiters, very, very few of them started at 10 years old and said, I want to be a corporate recruiter, and have made a straight line to that.
I'm glad you brought them up, because they are really the gatekeepers to actually talking to the person who has the job you want to be interviewed for. And
the number of incredibly successful people in business who start out, George Soros did philosophy, for crying out loud. So the fact that you are not, you are by no means the only person who has not, been reading the Wall Street Journal since you were 5. Most people who work in industries did not imagine themselves being in those industries, and maybe they're very, very happy in them. Maybe they're not. But there is a lot of contingency in everyone's life. So.
Some of them love history too.
Yes, exactly.
That's true, actually.
Quite right.
You've been waiting for a long time.
Yes, I have a question. I'm at ABD right now, and I'm sort of planning to go on the job market pretty soon. But one of the things I would like to do is to pursue Plan B simultaneously with Plan A. Is that even possible? Do you recommend trying to do something like that? Or is it just, because what I'm afraid of is if I leave academia, then it will be incredibly hard to come back in, because there's a general mindset as we talked about a few minutes ago that if you leave academia, then you're not serious enough as a scholar, you sort of made your decision and you moved on. So I was wondering if you have any recommendations for graduate students who are trying to decide what options to pick, what life path to choose.
can say, because I have advised students on exactly that issue, and I advise them to try to pursue both paths at the same time as much as they can. No question, though, what you're saying. You leave academia and there's a tremendous bias against you within academia. Now, if you've left academia for a few years and you're still able to keep up your research, you probably won't face that bias. But if you leave academia for any longer than that, or if you are not able to keep up your research, then there's going to be a tremendous bias.
One of the things I'm concerned about is, I know a lot of people do is they start adjuncting after graduating as a way to maintain a connection with academia, and I'm willing to do that. I don't want to adjunct because it doesn't pay very well.
Good.
Yeah,
it's an economic exploitative system that sort of pushes down wages and sort of
and the bias against that as well, right? So if you're adjuncting for years, there's also a bias against you getting.
Yeah.
I would say the question is sort of how will the people who are in some kind of position to help you get a job react? Because if your advisor sort of looks at this choice and says, well, this proves she's not really serious. I can sort of write the longer letter for someone else. That's kind of a calculation. Is there some chance that word will go out in, sort of at the AHA, oh, she's also applying for, things at McKinsey? No. I don't think the world works that way. So, I think it's a question of how many hours a day you have. How much sleep do you have?
And one of the most heartening things I've heard, I was at the environmental history meeting last weekend, and this is not someone I met, but someone telling me about somebody that they know who is importing a particular kind of fish from Alaska and bringing it to Wisconsin. And this is sort of a side thing while being a grad student. I thought, that is so refreshing to hear because we've become so tunnel visioned about doing the one thing, about that being all that matters. And I do think that there's an entirely different world out there that maybe, I could see that long term being pretty lucrative and ended up being a career, but not a reason to sort of make a decision between one or the other necessarily.
I would also encourage you to think specifically about a particular job, not the fact whether it's academic or not. They're all opportunities, and as everyone knows, not all academic jobs are created equal. And so the question may be, what are the opportunities available to you? What feels best? What looks right to you? And I think that might help make the decision, as opposed to thinking, will I ever be able to get back into academia, saying, do I want the academic job which is available to me at this point, or is this other opportunity look better to me? And I think that's the kind of prioritization you need to do, is look at the existing jobs, not sort of the categorization or the kind of ideal of the job that might be out there, because there's not sort of like the non-academic job and the academic job. All of us have had different jobs, and all of you have had different experiences in life, and you know that how they're categorized or what they're supposed to be is not actually always what they feel like. And so I think you need to look at it and say, if my opportunity is University A, College B, Company C, which of those opportunities feels like it's going to be the best fit for you? And for all the things that matter to you in terms of family, lifestyle, location, and everything else, salary, and everything else that we have to think about.
Yeah, managing opportunity is very difficult. And, at one point, I was still doing my job at Oxford University Press of copywriting, reading manuscripts, writing about them, loved it. But then I was also made direct mail manager, which was awful. It was just terrible. But of course, what did all the headhunters want to hire me for? Direct mail. And I hung on, when I was ready to move on to someplace else, but I just didn't want to do the job everyone wanted to hire me for. And so I had to kind of steer against the current to get a job still in publishing, but that was advertising, copywriting, the creative, more fun job. But sometimes you find yourself kind of, just not taking anything that comes along, but really trying to fight the current sometimes. It's very hard to manage opportunities, and when you do make a leap, then it's going to go in directions you can't foresee, and we have no advice for you.
Well, I want to thank all the panelists. Thank you all for coming out. I'm sure that if you had